On the sunny afternoon of July the 27th, 1999, a careless outdoors company led a group of 45 backpackers into a flooded gorge in the Swiss countryside. This is the Sexetenbach Gorge Tragedy. Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. My name's Ryan from Tragedy Tales, and on this channel, almost every single week, we cover anything tragic. Whether that be a caving disaster, a plane crash, or a bizarre death, we cover it all. But in this video, we're turning back the calendar to 1999, the year that I was born in fact. With the introduction of the Euro and the first episode of SpongeBob SquarePants being aired, 1999 was filled with wonder, joy, and its fair share of tragedies. But the tragedy involved in this video begins in Kent, England, where a group of 99 eager backpackers, ranging from the ages of 19 to 40, signed up for a 3-week tour across Europe with a booking company called Kon-Tiki, their faces etched with joy as they enlisted with close friends and family. This trip was meant to be the trip of a lifetime, something that they remember for years to come, a statement that would sadly turn out to be right for all the wrong reasons. Now, Kon-Tiki was and still is a brochure-type company based in Kent, New Zealand, and Australia. They focus on creating package holidays targeted towards young thrill seekers, ranging from river rapids, daring parachutes, and epic bungee jumping. After signing up in early July of 1999, the group of eager-eyed thrill seekers hopped on buses from London and made their way across the Eurotunnel and into France. Friends and family enjoyed each other's company. In their buses, they toured across Europe for 3 weeks, moving towards Switzerland. One of the groups that joined the tour was New Zealand residents 24-year-old Kelly Swanson Rowe and 30-year-old John Rowe. They'd gotten married 3 years previously, and John had just finished his final university exam. This trip was their yearly overseas holiday and their reward for all the hard work they'd done that year. On the travels, the group did what you'd expect, stopping a few days at each location until they came to the scenic Swiss town in the heart of the Alps, Interlaken. Interlaken is a traditional resort town with around 23,000 inhabitants. It's a well sought-after destination for tourists, nestled in the pristine mountainous regions of Bernese Oberland. Interlaken is known as the adventure capital of Switzerland. While many visit Interlaken for its copious amounts of hiking and skiing trails, the biggest draw for most thrill seekers visiting the small town was the Saxetenbach Gorge. Now, the Saxetenbach Gorge is, well, a gorge, located nearby the village of Saxeten, around a 15-minute drive from Interlaken, formed over thousands of years of erosion from the Saxetenbach River running through the village of Saxeten and joining the Lutschein River in Wilderswil. Raised above a narrow valley between the emerald waters of Lakes Thun and Brains, Saxetenbach Gorge takes around 2 to 3 hours to traverse and can only be navigated by canyoning. Canyoning involves swimming, sliding, jumping or abseiling down mountain streams, sometimes without boats or rigging. Naturally, you've got to be pretty good at both climbing, hiking, and swimming to even consider partaking in this kind of activity. Now, the gorge itself is not technically a slot canyon, similar to what I've covered in the Antelope Canyon disaster, top right if you're interested in that. Instead, Saxetenbach Gorge consists of many steep waterfalls into pools of water. Some parts can be walked through, but in most places, it requires you to wade through water or use a raft. Not to forget, in certain parts, you have to submerge completely to continue. While the gorge is mostly open with exits towards the bottom, there are parts near the top and the middle that the rocky walls are so high that they tower over those within, making climbing out impossible. While in Interlaken, the group, just like many other tourists, just couldn't resist the lure of the canyon. So, an optional canyon trip was offered to the group, organised by a local company in Interlaken named Adventure World. Adventure World was a Swiss adventure outdoors company that opened their doors to hikers in 1992. And back then, they only offered bungee jumping. Fast forward a few years, the owners saw profit in the local Saxetenbach Gorge and actually set to mapping it, putting in bolts and safety lines into the rock themselves. Within 6 months, they were guiding groups through the gorge. In 1999, the co-founder of Adventure World, George Hodel, said, and I quote, "Our goal is to bring the sensation of nature to a broad audience, not just to climbers, but to everyone. Our company targets ordinary people who have no previous knowledge of the activity. We supply the gear and the guides. They can go for adventure the same day they sign up." Within the space of just a few years, things at Adventure World quickly ramped up. Before long, they had 44 guides taking groups up and down the canyon on an endless, monotonous cycle. By 1995, they found themselves pushing huge numbers, often topping 500 people in the gorge per day. Staff soon found themselves struggling to keep up with the workload. Under constant pressure, this led them to take risks to maintain profits. But we'll come back to that. When the canyoning trip was offered to the group, some jumped at the opportunity, but some were a bit hesitant, including Auckland resident John Rowe, insisting that his wife Kelly instead take the rafting course. Kelly was adamant that she wanted to go into the gorge. So John buckled and they both decided to go. After discussing, out of the 99 that were on the tour, only 44 chose to go in the gorge that day, each paying $60 for Adventure World to safely guide them through it. Around 4 p.m. on July the 27th, 1999, the group parked and offloaded those who weren't up for the challenge in a mountain house, and the group of 45 made their way to the Adventure World Centre, located a short drive from the gorge. Before the trip, apparently many of the travellers had no idea what canyoning was. It just sounded like a fun thing to do. When they arrived at Adventure World, the group all signed waivers to say the company couldn't be held responsible if they were injured on the trip, and without much thought, they donned life jackets and wetsuits, and set off in 4 groups of 10 to 12 towards the canyon, each group accompanied by 1 or 2 guides from Adventure World. Surrounded by the Alps, the air was strangely still. The group couldn't help but sense that something was wrong, including the guides. The sky began to turn dark and gloomy, and it began to spit with rain. That morning, a local weather warning was issued for the surrounding area, indicating the risk of heavy thunderstorms. Adventure World was fully aware of the forecast and decided that it wouldn't be too bad. Besides, everyone was equipped with safety gear. What was there to worry about? By 5 p.m, the first group arrived at the gorge. By now, the sun had just about set and it was beginning to get dark. More storm clouds moved in and the rain only got worse and worse. Stood by the entrance, the cold water surged into the rocky depths below, and it's only at this moment did people realise what they'd actually signed up for. With the rain continuing to pound down, the guides stepped away to discuss if they would even continue. A few minutes later, they announced that they weren't 100% sure about going ahead, but then reassured participants, saying that the risk was low and that there were many exit points along the canyon, should they need to make a quick escape. The groups believed this and trusted the guides with their lives. As the groups prepared to enter, a man named Martin Seamatter, a local volunteer firefighter from a village upstream, approached them. He told the group that there was a severe thunderstorm brewing high up in the mountains and that they should not enter the gorge under any circumstances. That very afternoon, these exact same warnings were heeded by another adventure company, leading them to call off their planned canyon trips that day. However, the guides from Adventure World were stubborn. They replied to Martin, telling him that they knew the gorge and that they knew what they were doing. They were going in, if he liked it or not. Everyone in the groups continued to trust the guides, believing that this was their day job, and they did this every day, and so they must know best. They ignored Martin's warnings and entered the gorge at approximately 5 p.m. As they lowered themselves into the choppy, frigid water, thunder rumbled above, while lightning lit up the sky. It was truly amazing. It was exactly what they had in mind, albeit a bit more dark and rainy than imagined. Guides shouted for joy as they splashed in the crystal clear water and slid down steep waterfalls, the groups following soon after. Around 40 minutes later, the remaining 3 groups had now entered the gorge, bringing the total number of people inside to 53. Wading through the gorge and leaping down waterfalls, it was such an adrenaline rush, one that at first was totally worth the risk. At approximately 5:40 p.m, the first group were busy making their way down when they came to a difficult part of the gorge called the Fridge. To cross, you have to fully submerge yourself into the strong currents and carefully squeeze between boulders, and then have to pull yourself along a violent waterfall. While participants floated in the water, waiting to pass this notoriously difficult stretch, it was now completely dark and the rain had only continued to get worse. They were caught in a storm, just as the volunteer firefighter had warned. The beautifully clear water below began to transform into a dark, murky brown, and began rising at an exponential pace, moving from ankle height to knee height in just seconds. While the guides had been in the canyon in storms before, this was like nothing they'd ever seen. Without showing the groups they were already in a complete panic, guides ushered the groups to hurry. Fighting the water, everyone in the gorge frantically fought their way down, wading through the fast-rising waters, when all of a sudden, one of the guides screamed, "Get out of the water." The groups that were situated near the top of the canyon looked up to see a monster 22-foot wall of raging water and debris bouncing off the rocky walls, heading right towards them. Some froze in their tracks like deer in headlights. While the guide wasn't lying in saying that there were many exits, these exits, as I said, were mostly near the bottom of the gorge. Due to just truly unlucky timing, 2 out of the 4 groups found themselves in areas where there was no exit. They were helpless as the water raced towards them. The water was furious, its power immense. Within a blink of an eye, the torrent reached the group at the top of the gorge, smashing, crushing, and sweeping away anything caught in its tracks. This included heavy boulders and trees that it dislodged on the way down. As the groups tumbled down the gorge, it was a total bloodbath. Rain continued to belt from above as groups were forcibly dragged down the gorge, ricocheting off the jagged rocks as they did, knowing every impact could be lethal. 24-year-old Kelly and 30-year-old John Rowe from New Zealand were in one of the later groups. As John hopped into a raft situated in the gorge, Kelly suddenly had a bad stomach pain, as if something was about to go terribly wrong. Kelly told John this, and John told her to wait for the next group and let her stomach settle, pushing off into the water with 11 other jolly canyoners. 5 minutes after John pushed off, Kelly got into the next group's raft, and as soon as they did, they heard a snapping, rumbling noise in the distance. Her group quickly vacated the raft and watched as seconds later it was swept away by the raging wall of water. Kelly knew that it was heading right towards her husband. One of those also caught in the water from the Kontiki tour was a 21-year-old Australian named Tiffany Johnson. In the chaos, she'd just about managed to grab onto a rocky outcrop and managed to grab some air. As she caught her breath and wiped the dirt and debris out of her eyes, her vision focused on her surroundings to reveal a complete nightmare. She watched as some of her closest friends flew past her, motionless in the water, followed by many more. Here, Tiffany desperately clung on for dear life, all while being barraged by the force of the water. As she did, boulders and trees shot by at great speed. In fear of being pinned or crushed by these, Tiffany let go again, entrusting her life with the water. It swept her down the gorge and over a huge waterfall. Tiffany resurfaced to find herself in a calm pool. While she tread water, processing what had just happened, she felt a hand touch her shoulder. She looked up to see a survivor standing out of the water, panting, saying that they needed to get to safety. She grabbed on their hand and got herself out of the water. Along with Tiffany washed up one other survivor and a guide. The 4 of them now focused on making their way back up the mountain to see if there was anyone they could save. The group of survivors slipped and toppled as they fought to get their way up. The rain had turned the slopes into a deadly mudslide, but they just focused on the goal. They focused on getting to the top. When they finally got there, much to their relief, they were met by a rescue team. The survivors burst into tears. By 6 p.m, the incident reached global news, but it was strangely vague at first. Just news stating that tourists had been caught in a storm and that rescue was underway. Rescue teams extracted the remaining survivors to hospital and continued to scour the gorge for those missing. They found the odd body here and there, but the majority were missing. Rescuers assumed that they must have washed all the way through the canyon, but as it was dark, it was difficult to look for them. The next day, on July the 28th, the sun rose on the small town of Saxeton, revealing the true scale of the disaster. Around 3 miles away from the gorge, as joggers ran their usual route around Lake Brains, they came across numerous bodies floating in the water. They were laid face down, surrounded by wood and debris. When the police arrived to get them out of the water, they found that they had been completely pulverized beyond recognition by boulders and trees. Brains were crushed, and torsos were split. Some of the bodies were so badly traumatized that they had to be identified through tattoos, DNA, and dental analysis. A man named Ulrich from the Swiss forensics team likened their injuries to those suffered in a plane crash. Identifying the victims proved to be a lot more difficult than first expected. Some victims had their heads so battered it was impossible to identify them. Due to the nature of the trip, people were from all across the globe. So, 8 people who opted out of the canyon course were forced to help identify their friends in the dead. Sadly, John Rowe, Kelly's lifelong partner, the love of her life, died in the flood. He'd inadvertently saved her life by telling her to wait for the other raft. After the incident, families of the victims received no communication as to the safety of their loved ones. They were left completely in the dark, not knowing if they were lost, injured, or dead. Some families claimed, and I quote, that the Adventure World Company was too pathetic and gutless to break the news. That day, the media announced the first death toll, announcing that 17 people had been found dead in the water and that several people were still missing. They couldn't be sure if they were killed by drowning or crushed. The death toll would only rise in the coming days as more and more got identified. As exhausted rescuers finished their second day searching the gorge, the death toll rose to 19, with 3 still missing. A couple of weeks later, they found 2 more people, but one person, even to this very day, has not been found.
21 people died canyoning on this river just outside Interlaken. 2 New Zealanders, John Rowe, tourist, and Andrew Lee, himself a company guide, were among those swept away in a flash flood.
The youngest to die was a 19-year-old and the oldest 31. 14 Australians, 1 New Zealander, 2 South Africans, 2 Swiss, and 2 people from Britain lost their lives. 3 of the dead were guides, turning this into the worst canyoning accident in history. The disaster and its death toll spread rapidly across the globe. To avoid tarnishing one of their most popular tourist hotspots, Swiss officials detailed the incident as an unforeseeable act of God, and that Adventure World knew the gorge and took all precautions possible to prevent the tragedy. However, this simply wasn't true. It would soon be revealed that the management actually forced the guides to take the groups to ensure profits remained high, under the direct threat of being fired, no matter the forecast. After a bit of investigation, it was found that the thunderstorm had caused a natural dam to break high up in the mountains. When it did, it rushed down and completely flooded the canyon, something that locals had witnessed before and was apparently not out of the ordinary. If the groups had listened to the various warnings that day, nobody would have lost their lives. In the wake of the tragedy, the gorge was closed off for the foreseeable future, and both Adventure World and Kon-Tiki Tours took canyoning off its itineraries. Rescue teams and the public began to wonder why so late in the afternoon did they still set off into the gorge, knowing a thunderstorm was due. As victims of the families mourned the dead, they began to build legal cases against the management at Adventure World, seeking to bring those responsible to justice. In the coming months, as the pressure mounted against Adventure World, the Adventure World co-owner Georg was questioned about the incident. He said that the deaths were still difficult to comprehend, adding that he was unable to give any details about the incident because of the ongoing investigation, pledging that he'd answer all questions posed to him by the authorities. While awaiting a court date, it was clear that Adventure World did not learn any lessons. They continued to offer bungee jumps in the Swiss Alps, but less than 1 year after the tragedy in Saxetenbach, this also ended in disaster, killing a 22-year-old man after he was tethered to a bungee rope that was far too long. This ultimately was the nail in the coffin for Adventure World. After this second incident, they closed their doors, never to reopen again. On the 12th of December 2001, the 3 directors of Adventure World, Stefan Friedli, Peter Balmer, and Georg Hodel, appeared in court, along with 3 senior guides and 2 junior guides, charged with negligent manslaughter. Under Swiss law, this carries a sentence of 3 years or a fine of up to $22,000. All of them denied the charges, saying that the flash flood was entirely unforeseeable. In a trial that garnered global media attention, after some deliberation, the verdicts were reached, and Adventure World were found guilty of negligent manslaughter. The judge for the case, Thomas Zabinden, said that Adventure World had a severe lack of care for safety, stating that safety measures taken by them were totally inadequate, borderline non-existent. Investigators discovered that Adventure World had 0 safety protocols for the trips whatsoever, with no proper safety training for the employees either. It was a classic case of profit over safety. He said that the trip to the gorge should have never taken place, as the approaching storm had been forecast and was visibly approaching. With this verdict, each of the 3 directors were handed a small 3 to 5 month suspended prison sentence and a $10,000 fine each, a very low price to pay for 21 people. The senior guides were given even shorter sentences and smaller fines, while the other 2 junior guides were found not guilty. As the verdict was read, the Adventure World management sat quietly and left immediately after, without giving any reaction to families and friends of the dead, bringing this horrible chapter to an honestly disappointing end. In 2003, a memorial was set up near the gorge. It consisted of a wooden shelter with a wooden wall, plastered with the photos of the dead, along with flowers and messages from the bereaved families. Not far from there sits a large boulder from the gorge featuring a golden plaque listing the names of the 21 people who lost their lives. 24 years on from this terrible tragedy, Sexetenbach Gorge remains a popular attraction to this day, with canyon trips being offered by real, safe outdoor companies. The amount of suffering brought by Adventure World is hard to measure. Their carelessness destroyed families, some lost their friends, some lost cousins, some lost husbands and wives. Most survivors now suffered with survivor's guilt, but this was just awful. It's probably one of the worst cases of carelessness that I've ever covered, and it's the worst kind of carelessness too. They knew the storm was brewing, but they didn't care. They let groups enter knowing that the water could surge through at any moment. Personally, I'm glad that they were found guilty, but I'm also a bit frustrated at the length of the sentences and fines. In my opinion, they should have been much, much greater. But what do you think? Should they have been given larger sentences? I'm interested in hearing all of your thoughts below. I read every comment, but as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.